Good morning, everyone. I came across an article from Biblical NonOrthodoxy entitled James, Paul, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he says, underneath that, he says, take a minute and reread the Epistle of James with the thought that every word is written to refute the false teachings of Paul. And I'd recently done a video exactly on the same topic, and I see his take on it, and I like his take, and I want to share that with you. And he had a very nice statement here. Uh, he says, please consider reposting or linking to this article. Thank you, RD. So the author of this article actually wants me to repost his content. So I'm going to take him up on that. I think he's like me, is I nobody wants to claim it's mine versus yours. We are trying to advance the cause of Christ. So we're going to share with one another, and others can post my articles if you wish, but give me credit or say who it came from, so that if, in case you've made a change or an edit, someone might alert the author, the original author, there has been a change. All right. Anyway, so here we go. James, Paul, and the Dead Sea Scrolls by Hanan ben Avraham. Hello. For my subject, my aim is to use ancient sources that tell us what we know about James and Paul, and to analyze what they say and see what use they may have for the religious minded. Little is me, but the arrangement of passages, I hope, will be clear and relevant, and occasional comments. Have you heard about James, the brother of Jesus? About his election to succeed Jesus and about his death? We are not informed by canonical Acts, the book of Acts by Luke. We must go to other sources. Eusebius of Caesarea, 260 to 340 Christian era, Archbishop under Constantine, tells us in his ecclesiastical history that James was, quote, the Lord's brother who had been elected by the apostles to the episcopal throne at Jerusalem, end of quote. That's Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Chapter 23. Knowing Jesus would soon depart from them, his disciples, according to the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, asked him who would lead them. Quote, and Jesus said to them, in the place you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into existence. Coptic Logion 12 of the Gospel of Thomas. Palestinian Epiphanius, Bishop of Salamis, 315, born 315, Christian era, died in 404 Christian era, had access to works he said were called the this is going to be a tough one, Anabothmoi Jacobo, or the Ascents of James, and the Gospel of the Hebrews, used by the ancient Jewish Christians called Ebionites, or the poor, both now lost, in which we learn, quote, once during a drought, he, James, lifted his hands to heaven and prayed, and at once heaven sent rain. Thus they no longer called him by his name, but his name was rather the righteous one, in Hebrew, the Zedek. Next quote. To James alone it was allowed to enter once a year into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum of the temple, because he was a Nazarite and connected to the priesthood. Hence Mary was related in two ways to Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, and James was a distinguished member of the priesthood because the two tribes alone were linked to one another, the royal tribe to the priestly. Panarian 30. Let me just pause there. So Mary's, it said in the book of Luke that Mary's cousin is Elizabeth, who's married to a Levite priest named Zacharias. Well, a Levite could not marry anyone but a Levite, which means that the parent of Elizabeth had to be Levite. And since that parent was a brother or sister of Mary's mother or father, mother or father, then both Elizabeth and Mary are in the lineage of the priests. So they're Levites, okay? And that's where you get a marriage in the sense of Jesus' line through Mary. You get Mary as Levite, and that's the priestly line, and then you get the lineage of the seed of David, which is through Joseph. Hanan ben Avraham resumes this article. He tells us the ascent of James was about the discourses James gave from the temple to the Jerusalem masses, and says that James was the first to whom the Lord entrusted his throne upon earth. Jerome, 342 to 420 Christian era, basing his knowledge on Hegesippus, Clement of Alexandria, and the Jewish historian Josephus. Also knows this when he says in his Lives of Illustrious Men, chapter 2, this is Jerome, says that, quote, he, James alone, enjoyed the privilege of entering the Holy of Holies, since indeed he did not wear woolen, but only linen clothes, and went into the temple alone and prayed on behalf of the people, so that his knees were reputed to have acquired the callousness of a camel's knee, end of quote. And Jerome continues, and that after Jesus died, he, quote, was immediately appointed Bishop of Jerusalem by the apostles, end of quote. Palestinian Jewish Christian Hegesippus, 100 Christian era to 180 Christian era, portions of whose 5 books of the early Christian history only survive in passages cited by Josephus, tells us, quote, "There were many James, but this one, the Lord's brother, was holy from his birth. Everyone from the Lord's time till our own has called him the righteous." End of quote. And that, quote, "because of his unsurpassable righteousness, he was called the righteous," and oblias, the latter, end of quote, the latter being a strange word he describes as meaning, quote, "bulwark of the people and righteousness," end of quote. Ecclesiastical History 2.23. For Epiphanius, the word means, quote, "wall," and for Eusebius, quote, "the protection of the people." The 2nd century Syriac Apostolic Constitutions tells us that James was the, quote, "brother of Christ according to the flesh, and one appointed Bishop of Jerusalem by the Lord himself." That's at 8.35 of Apostolic Constitutions. In another passage surviving only in Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria, who died in 215 Christian era, tells us that the gift of knowledge was imparted by Jesus to, quote, "James the righteous, to John, and to Peter," end of quote. And remember, Paul calls those the pillars in Galatians chapter 2, those 3. And that these in turn, quote, "delivered it to the rest of the apostles, and they to the 70, of whom Barnabas was one," end of quote. Eusebius' work, Ecclesiastical History 2.1. Clement of Rome, who was born in 30 AD and died in 97 Christian era, or someone purporting to be him, addresses his letter in the non-canonical pseudo-Clementine homilies of Clement to, quote, "James, the Bishop of Bishops, who rules Jerusalem, the holy assembly of the Hebrews, and the assemblies everywhere," end of quote, as does Peter Simile in his homilies letter. Even Josephus, who was born in 37 Christian era, dies in 96 Christian era, who was not a Christian as we understand it, but who was contemporary of James, knows about him, and even insists that James' death was the reason the Jewish people believed Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. Josephus states, quote, "These things, the uprising and consequent destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, happened to the Jews in requital for James the righteous, who was a brother of Jesus known as Christ, for though he was most righteous of men, the Jews put him to death," end of quote. That's Josephus. This passage, remarked on also by Origen, he was born in 185 and died in 254 Christian era, and Jerome, only exists in Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, Jerome's commentary on Galatians, and Origen's letter, and the letter was entitled Contra Celsus at 1.47, and interestingly, is no longer extant in any manuscript we have of Josephus. Commenting on it, Eusebius says, quote, "So remarkable a person must James have been, so universally esteemed for righteousness, that even the most intelligent of Jews felt this was why his martyrdom was immediately followed by the siege of Jerusalem." End of quote. Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius 2.23. This contradicts Christian belief that the temple fell because of the prophecy and death of Jesus, as Origen is well aware, and it pains to correct in Contra Celsus. This latter also tells us that, quote, "the wonderful thing is that, though he, Josephus, did not accept Jesus as Christ, he yet gave testimony that the righteousness of James was so great that the people thought they had suffered these things on account of him." This is in Origen's commentary on Matthew 10, verse 10.17. For his part, Jerome, in his book Lives, writes, quote, "This same Josephus records the tradition that this James was of so great holiness and reputation among the people that the destruction of Jerusalem was believed to have occurred on account of his death," end of quote. And in the commentary, Jerome writes, quote, "So holy was James that the people zealously tried to touch the fringes of his garment." That's in commentary by Jerome on Galatians at 1, verse 19. Let's now remember how James, the brother of Jesus, was perceived by his contemporaries. We hear these praises of him, quote, "For those whose sake heaven and earth came into existence." That was Jesus' words in the Gospel of Thomas. Quote, "Holy from his birth, the righteous one, the bulwark of the people," and even ascribing the fall of Jerusalem was on account of his death. These are strong words, and not to be lightly dismissed, and are consistent with what all sources say about James. It is important to point out that our sources are not presenting James as just the head of Christianity, but the popular Jewish leader of his day, the Tzaddik par excellence, whose death brought the downfall of Jerusalem, and is in keeping with the notion in Proverbs 10:25 and Zohar 1.959b that the, quote, "the Tzaddik is the foundation," end of quote, and the, quote, "pillar that upholds the world." Paul understands this when he speaks in Galatians of going up to Jerusalem and meeting, quote, "James, Cephas, and John, those reputed to be pillars," end of quote, Galatians 2, verse 9. And Paul's attitude towards them is very, very helpful in determining who is the parallel character in the Dead Sea Scrolls, known as the windbag, the comedian, the spatter of lies, the man of scoffing. Josephus and Hegesippus, and because of them, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, who died in 235 Christian era, Origen, Eusebius, Epiphanius, Jerome, even ancient Christian literature recently found the Nag Hammadi in Egypt, like the Lost Gospel of Thomas above, knew of James' death, but not Luke as the writing of Acts. And this is my insert here. This supports strongly that the book of Acts is written in the 60s as part of a legal appellate brief for Paul's appeal to Nero Caesar, for which Paul is awaiting his hearing at Rome, which is how Acts ends. Everybody ignores how Acts ends. He's waiting for the appeal. So this is written for the appeal, as Mr. Mauck in his recent book called In Defense of Paul, I believe, systematically proved, and is consistent with the early Christian intentions and understandings of what the books of both Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts were both for that legal appeal. All right, and finally, Mr. Avraham remarks as follows. Because Josephus knew of it, the death of James, firsthand, it would seem best to use his account. All right, so that's going to end part 1. We'll pick up part 2 with Josephus's account of the death of James. All right, take care. Ciao. Bye.